Welcome to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast, your guide to future tech trends and innovation in a language you understand. Now, over to your host, Neil Hughes.
In the last few episodes, we've talked about what feels like a never-ending wave of constant cyber attacks, email vulnerabilities, and also how in the eyes of users and businesses, there are elements of threat intelligence fatigue, where people are now switching off from their online responsibilities. But I've come across a pretty cool product called Inky recently. The add-on for Outlook and Gmail detects email-based spear phishing attempts, and it uses a wide variety of heuristics, including machine learning analysis of the images and text in messages. So it's pretty interesting technology. David Baggett is a software entrepreneur and a founder of Inky that has been writing and commercializing software since his childhood. His goals are the same now as they were then, to solve difficult and practical problems with software. And he said, "I seek problems where the technological and domain challenges pose a significant barrier to entry and thus a defensible initial market position." So enough from me, buckle up and hold on tight, because it's time to beam your ears all the way to Washington DC so we can speak with David Baggett, founder of Inky, about his tech startup journey and solving real problems. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell me a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm Dave Baggett, and I'm currently the founder of a company called Inky. This is my third startup I've been involved with in three totally different areas, all software, but three different areas of software. First was games and then travel software, and now we're doing cybersecurity software, particularly around protecting against phishing attacks, which I can explain what those are for your listeners if some people may not know.
Absolutely, because I have read a lot about you guys recently, but I'm conscious for anyone listening, they're going to be thinking, what exactly is Inky? And what is Inky Fish Fence? And also, what problems does it solve?
Yeah, so Inky is our company name, and our mascot. He's a little octopus. And we like to say Inky eats fish for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. What we mean by fish is, phishing emails are really right now, by many metrics, they're the number one cyber attack, what we call cyber attack vector. They're the number one way bad guys do bad things to people on the internet. And it really takes two different forms. One is it's always through email. In the case we're talking about email-based phishing. And it comes in one of two forms. One is you'll get a mail that looks like it's from someone important in your life or in your company. So a classic example would be a message from the CFO that says to wire money, and it'll say things like, the attacker will even study the CFO's social media profile so they can say something convincing like, I'm going to be golfing this weekend and, I'll be with Sally and the kids. So just make sure this wire goes out by 4 p.m. today. And it turns out that wire request is actually not from the CFO. It's a forged mail with the CFO's name in the header and convincingly looking like it's from the CFO, but it isn't. And this accounts for, in the U.S., over $1 billion of wire fraud a year. And that's reported incidents. So we can imagine there's a lot more that goes unreported. That's one form of it where someone impersonates a person. The other form of it we see a lot of is impersonating a brand. And there, the classic example is you'll get a message that looks like it's from Google or Dropbox or Facebook or Apple, some major brand, and it'll ask you to log in to take some action, or it'll be a document. It'll be, if it's a DocuSign document you're supposed to sign. It looks very convincingly like it really is from that company, but it turns out it's actually an attacker. And when you log in, essentially what you've just done when you click through and log in to this fake site is you've given them your account credentials for that account. So then they can go and do whatever they want with your Dropbox account or your DocuSign account or your Apple account. So those are really the two categories of phishing that we talk about. And what we do is we have software that, if you think about when you go on Facebook, sometimes it'll tell you, hey, that looks like it's your sister. Do you want to tag her image with her name? And they do that because they've trained algorithms to understand faces and to recognize faces. We do that sort of thing on the text in the message, the domain names, the headers, even the imagery. And so in a similar way, we have the program look at the mail and can make a determination of, number one, who's it trying to pretend to be, or who does it look like it's from? Your CEO, your CFO, your mom, Bank of America, who does it look like it's from on the one hand, and then on the second hand, is it really from that sender? Is it legitimately from that sender? And if we can line up those two things, then we know it's a valid mail. If it looks like it's from Bank of America and it's not from one of their allowed mail servers, then we know it's a malicious attempt to defraud you somehow. So that's sort of the very high level view of this. And really, you can think of this as kind of an endless arms race. It's the attackers are getting smarter and smarter, and I can give you some really scary examples of how they're getting smarter. And then on the defensive side, we keep building more and more intelligence into the software to find more and more of these attacks and block them.
I've seen so many examples of this in real life as well. It doesn't matter how many strict cybersecurity controls or solutions are in place. I think hackers or the bad guys have actually realised that the weakest point of entry is actually the company's own employees. And a lot of companies don't even think about educating their staff. And we all know people that have clicked on that PDF in an email or the zip file, and we all know what happens next. But I'm curious, what was the inspiration behind Inky? I mean, were you on the other side of the fence? Have you seen this before? Or what was it that put you on this particular startup journey?
Yeah, so two things really. So my background is in artificial intelligence, my academic background. When I went to school, I went to the artificial intelligence laboratory at MIT, where I studied a slightly different area of artificial intelligence than we're using in Inky, but it's called natural language processing. So I have a background in what people now call machine learning. We didn't really call it that very often then. Yeah. But it was essentially the same thing, artificial intelligence. And then the other thing is that I just happened to work in cybersecurity very early. In fact, when I was still a teenager, I grew up in I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, and one of the people who was formative in developing a bunch of the standards at the National Security Agency, the NSA everyone talks about now, that same NSA develops a lot of the standards for computer security. And he's one of the pioneers of that. He started a company, and I happened to work for him in the 80s because he was, right down the road. And my mom knew someone who knew someone at the company, and they kind of let me get a job there. I think probably figuring they were doing my mom a favor, but I actually ended up being a pretty useful programmer for them, even though I was young. So I got a really early start in this cybersecurity space. I sort of went through various paths along the way, but for me, it's sort of like coming back home in a way to work on both artificial intelligence on the one hand and cybersecurity on the other.
So what lessons have you learned along the way? I mean, you did mention a few moments ago about some of those scary examples. Do you have any of those as well?
Yeah, so I mean, this is kind of the most interesting part of this. And, this was true both of the previous company I did, which was travel software. We did a search engine for travel, which ultimately we sold to Google, and that's now Google Flights. And one of the things that's really interesting about both these problem spaces, and it's true of a lot of software, I think, a lot of the complexity comes not so much from the algorithms or from writing the code itself, but from the domain. So there's just all kinds of domain complexity around email, and not all for good reasons, right? I mean, if you think about email, it's kind of like the first protocol on the internet. And so the first emails were sent in the early 70s. There was no concept of security. I like to tell people, that with respect to email, HTML is a new feature, right? HTML was added to email really late in its life in the 90s. So that's how old email is. And so there's all this complexity that's accreted around it. And one of the things that's sort of the hallmark of all these early internet protocols is they were developed in an academic setting where there was no real concern about security. And so the fact that you can send a mail and put anything you want in the from line, that's always been true of mail, and that's just a fundamental problem with email, right? It's what we would say, it's not authenticated, right? You don't have to prove you're you to send a mail from yourself. And in fact, anyone can send a mail that looks like it's from president@whitehouse.gov, right? So it's a really interesting problem area because of all the domain complexity. And then, of course, the examples of things we see on a daily basis are terrifying and fascinating. More recently, you talked about educating employees, and we're seeing that, while that's a really good practice, we're seeing that work less well because now the attackers are smart enough that they're doing things that you can't really see as a human. So an example that I like to give all the time is, think about the domain bankofamerica.com, right? Yeah. Now, what an attacker did, there was a phishing scam where they set up a domain and registered at bankofamerica.com, where they basically replaced the lowercase m in Bank of America with a lowercase rn. And that's 1 pixel different on the screen.
Yeah.
And so if you're hovering over a link and you're trying to discern the difference between bankofamerica.com/wire and the real thing, good luck, right? Yeah. And this is in the context of looking at 500 emails a day. So we're seeing things like that where the attackers, they don't have to do anything particularly fancy. Anybody can register any domain name, right? Yeah. It costs $20 to register a domain name. So the attacker will set up a domain name. We're also seeing cases where they'll take the exact HTML that the real company will send in a transactional email, and they'll copy everything in that and replicate it, and they'll change one link to be pointing to them. Also very hard to discern. They'll use all the same imagery. And then, of course, as I mentioned, we see lots and lots of examples of people using social media to study a target. Like someone could, for example, study you as a target and then send mail that looks like it's from you, even making it look like the language that you use in email, and send it to someone who would then think it's you and get them to do something that you ostensibly were asking them to do. So this is called spear phishing, where someone's going after a specific target. And those things are really, really hard to train people to spot. And you really have to have a hyper-vigilant entity looking at the mail on your behalf. And in more and more cases, that's not a human. It's got to be a program. And so, we think of it as, we want to make the algorithms look at the mail like a person would, except without missing even the tiniest detail.
So back to Inky. Why do you think users should use Inky to analyze every single email message? I mean, you've got plenty of good reasons there for actually using it. So I suppose what I should say is, what can it actually do, and the science behind it, the technology behind it, and how it actually helps users?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we sort of talked about it in the abstract, but yeah. I think the easiest way to think of it as a product is to sort of envision it. And we can't envision it on a podcast, but I can sort of paint the picture for you.
Sure.
Essentially, what it does is it runs right inside of Outlook or Gmail, and it's kind of like having a cybersecurity expert standing guard right next to you, looking at your mail as you read each mail. So as you look at the mail in Gmail or in Outlook, obviously it displays the message itself, but then alongside that will be Inky's analysis. And if the mail is legitimate, if it's really from you, for example, or if it's really from Bank of America, then Inky will put up a profile that shows you it knows who really sent that. In other words, it'll put up a Bank of America logo and it'll say this is really Bank of America, and we can prove that it came from their mail servers. And there's all kinds of cryptography going on under the hood there that's not very interesting from a user standpoint. But it does allow us to know with certainty whether a mail really is from the purported sender or not. And so we give them this comfort if we know who it's from. If we don't know who it's from, then we'll put sort of a question mark, head, person with a question mark as their face, and say, we don't really know who this is. It might not be bad, might not, we don't know. And so that's sort of the first high-level thing. They'll see information about who we could prove sent the message, if we can prove anything. And for big brands, we can always prove something, because the big brands always use what's called digital signatures to sign their outgoing mail. For individuals, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And then if Inky sees something suspicious or off about the message, a common one would be, if you read an article about phishing, the first thing you'll see is hover over the links, make sure they go where they say they go. So Inky sort of does that for you. It looks at all the links and makes sure they all go where you say they go. And if it doesn't, then it'll put up an orange warning that says, kind of like yellow alert, this is not necessarily malicious, but you should think about it. Look at this link carefully. And it tells you exactly which link it thought was suspicious. And then it looks at everything else in the message for signs of malicious intent. So it looks at the headers, which are kind of the plumbing of email. It'll look at all the words used in the message. It looks very carefully at sort of the from line and the to line and sees, is this really from this person, and is this person really in your company or not? And then it looks at things like the imagery in the message. So it'll figure out, for example, if a mail is pretending to be Dropbox, it'll figure that out, and it'll give you a warning that says, this is attempting to impersonate Dropbox. But explicitly tell you, this is someone trying to fool you. Or it'll say, this is someone trying to fool you into thinking it's your friend Neil, and it actually isn't him. We don't think it is him. Let's put it that way. And so that analysis, it appears in real time right inside of the mail client. So it's part of the normal mail flow. It's just extra information alongside the body of the message there. So that's kind of how it works. And for companies, we charge for this. We're making available a free version for consumer accounts. So people with regular Gmail accounts, not G Suite accounts, and regular Outlook.com accounts or Hotmail accounts will be able to use this. And I'm pleased to announce that on your podcast, actually, that we're going to make this available for free. And so people really have no reason not to try it. I mean, it's free and helpful and will probably protect you from getting phished. And we're offering this really as a public service just to get the word out and get people to know there are now solutions to this phishing problem that regular people can use. You don't have to be a cybersecurity expert to use this. You just kind of use it right inside Gmail or Outlook, and it does the work for you.
Fantastic. Well, that's certainly something I'm going to be checking out myself. One thing I've got to ask, though, if I look at my personal email on Outlook or Gmail, if you go into the junk folder, sometimes those junk folders get it wrong. For example, I've got a client where his email will always go to the junk folder and say this person is not who he claims to be. And I think he is who he says he is. At least I hope he does. He always pays me on time. But I've got to ask, I mean, does Inky ever get it wrong?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this is called the false positive issue. So any time you have a system trying to make a judgment using artificial intelligence or even simpler kinds of things, there are going to be false positives. And and that's even true of humans, right? Humans can falsely believe something is what it isn't. So the false positive issue is not limited to software. But the false positive issue, really, it's a matter of how you deal with this, right? So one of the problems that we solve, in some sense, is the what happened to my mail problem, right? So if you think about the way email security software works now, there's nothing that you see as an end user if the mail gets blocked.
Yeah.
It's just kind of what happened to my mail, right? And maybe it's in your junk folder. So maybe it gets foldered somewhere and you have to go find it. Some systems have a quarantine where you can go and log into some website and see where the mail got quarantined. That's one of the reasons why we like to give the user visual feedback right inside of Outlook or Gmail that says what we thought about the message. Now, you can configure, if you're a company, you can configure Inky to quarantine some mail that we're really highly sure is malicious. But those false positives, those ones we're not totally sure, hey, Inky saw something funny about this, but it's really humans going to have to make the ultimate judgment. We can then deliver that mail, and then the user will show the user what we thought was funny about it, and then the user can actually make the final decision. So it means that the penalty for us to have a false positive is a lot lower because the mail doesn't just get put into a black hole. And it also means, therefore, we can be more aggressive in what we check for, and in some sense be more careful, because we're not worried about making mistakes, right?
Now, free is my favourite price, so I'm certainly going to be checking it out. But if there is anybody listening out there that wants to give it a try as well, how do they integrate it with Outlook or Gmail? Can you just offer a bit of a guide on how they can get up and running as quickly as possible?
Yeah, so we have a page set up on our website, inky.com/techblogwriter, your blog name. And on that page, it has instructions and links to both the stores. So essentially, there's a different version for Outlook, and there are two different versions. One's for Outlook and one's for Gmail. The Gmail one is a Chrome extension, so it comes from the Chrome store, which is sort of like an app store. And similarly, the Outlook extension is what Microsoft calls an add-in. And what's nice about that is that it runs on every version of Outlook. So even if you're using Outlook on your phone or on the web, the Outlook add-in will run there. And again, it's kind of like an app store. You just go in and you'll link to the page and say, I want to install this, and it takes a few seconds to install it. It's basically like installing an app.
Does it also add to your mail client if you've got one? So I don't know if you are using the iOS mail on a Mac, for example, or does it only work when you actually go to the web email client?
Well, the free one only works with Outlook and Gmail. So Outlook on the desktop, Outlook on the web, so any version of Outlook.
Gotcha.
And then the Gmail web version. When companies deploy this, they're paying us, and so one of the things they get in exchange for paying us is they get a bunch of more features in terms of they get analytics about what's going on with the mail that's coming in, but they also get the ability to deploy it in a slightly different way, where they not only get the add-in, they also get, essentially it modifies the body of each message to put, if there's a warning, it'll put the message, the warning right above the message body. And so that way, if their users are using something like the iOS mail client, or really could be any third-party mail client, then they're still going to see the warning even though they won't have an add-in, right?
Yeah.
So where we can extend the code of the mail client, like we can with Gmail and we can with Outlook, we have an add-in, and then where we can't, for example, iOS mail, there really isn't any way to write a plugin or an extension. Then we can deploy it in such a way that the message itself gets modified, so the end user then still sees the analysis.
So after the controversy surrounding email services such as Unroll Me recently, there are going to be a lot of people wondering if Inky can actually read people's emails or mine data from their messages.
Yeah, we don't do that. So it really, the way the add-ins work is actually kind of nice, because they don't require us to have a whole analysis of the mail on our server side infrastructure. So the way it works generally is most of the analysis is actually happening in JavaScript code that's running inside of Outlook or in Gmail. And so most of what it's doing with your mail is happening right there. There are things that we look at. We'll look at real-time databases to see, for example, if the URLs mentioned in your mail have been reported as phishing. So those things, our servers will see those URLs because it has to classify them, but we're not sending the whole contents of the mail to our server. So the answer is we can't read the individual user's mail. No, we'll see some metadata from the messages, but we won't see the whole mail. And that's really by design. We don't actually want to see your mail. We don't. It's not something we want to see, frankly.
So do you have any examples of how Inky Fish has actually prevented phishing attacks, and also the kind of warnings that it will show? Yeah,
I mean, we're seeing hundreds of things a month now that, as far as we know, are the only thing that's blocking. So examples are, I mean, certainly what we've seen recently, the most phished is Amazon. So we just see tons and tons of Amazon, fake gift card, or it'll be log in and get some credit or something. And so clearly the attackers are going after Amazon in a big way. I'm not sure why that is. We see, on a daily basis, new kinds of attacks, and sometimes we'll get it because we'll see text in the message that's sort of unique to Amazon, and that'll trigger a classification that it's Amazon, or we'll see, an Amazon logo or something where we can tell pretty definitively it's trying to look like Amazon. And then, of course, we know exactly what servers Amazon uses to send mail. And so if we can't prove the message came from one of those servers, we're going to know it's a malicious phishing attempt. So that's a big one. I mean, we saw there was a very highly publicized Google Docs attack over the summer, which we blocked that. There was before that a DocuSign one where it was really particularly evil, because what this DocuSign attacker did was, number one, they somehow got access to DocuSign's customer database, or some subset of it. So they were able to mail people who really were DocuSign users and who were therefore primed to expect DocuSign messages. And then on the other hand, they set up domains like docusgn.com, DocuSign missing the I. And that triggers for us, we'll notice the similarity between docusgn.com and the real DocuSign. So that's a signal to us that, hey, this is trying to look like DocuSign. So that's another example. And then, more recently, there was a Dropbox one that was pretty widespread. And in some of these, you'll get dozens and dozens of examples to dozens of different accounts. And we have some honeypot accounts where we set them up intentionally to get these kinds of phish mails because we want to see them and be able to analyze them. So it's quite fascinating. I mean, I would say the more common stuff now is this kind of fiddle with the domain name. So register a domain name that's similar. Another thing that people used to do a lot of, and it's fading a little bit, is they would take a domain like Google, and they would register a new domain that was Google, except for instead of a Latin E, they would have a Cyrillic E. So it looks the same, but it's actually a different domain. And some of the registrars have gotten wise to that and are blocking a lot of it. But things like replacing M with RN, or replacing a D with CL, those are much harder for the registrars to detect. So we're seeing stuff like that. And we're also seeing in cases where attackers will breach a real company's website and are able to host pages on their real site. Wow. So then the phishing page isn't on some, the domain of the phishing page isn't something weird. it's a real company, right? So that's particularly nasty too, right? And there we can tell that the mail didn't come from that brand, right? So we can tell that whatever's going on with that site, that's not a real Dropbox message. It's not we're not really from them. So it's the kind of stuff we're seeing now that really is just fiendish. And you can think of it as, again, it's kind of an arms race, right? So, I mean, the attackers have access to all the same tools to see what gets through, and they're going to keep getting more and more clever. And it's cheap, right? I mean, it's cheap to send an email. For a lot of these guys, it's free. They just have botnets. They can send out as many mails as they want and keep testing stuff. And the other trend I would say we're seeing is the wire amounts are going down, or they'll do probe tests where they'll say, I want to do a small wire of, $1,286, some weird small amount. And they'll see if that goes through before they try to do a big, $100,000 wire. Wow. So that's another thing that's shifted a little bit in the strategy of the attackers. Nice, huh?
Yeah, great guys.
Great guys, right? I mean, it's cheap and it works, right? It only takes one sucker in your organization to fall for it, and they might get free money, or they might get, identity theft information. Or another common thing people will do is the attackers will pretend to be someone in payroll, and they'll say, hey, mail me all the W-2s, which is in the U.S., that's sort of an employment form. They'll say, mail the W-2s. And so there are incidents where people have mailed 10,000 W-2s to some organized crime syndicate that then has great identity theft information on those employees, right? So this stuff's just rampant now.
And there's always one person that will do it, isn't there? No matter what company, no matter where you are in the world, there's always one person that will accidentally do it.
Well, and that's really why ultimately we think the program's got to filter out the vast majority of this stuff, right? We're going to have to keep investing the industry's going to have to keep investing as we are in making the algorithms smarter and making the mail clients understand better the contents of the mail and actually be able to recognize, hey, this isn't really Amazon, right? I'm not even going to deliver this to the end user because I know it's not Amazon. And that's, ultimately it will get very, very hard. We've already made it a lot harder, but it'll get so hard to get past one of these systems that it'll stop being a very effective attack vector, and they'll move on to something else. But right now it's pretty easy to get past the existing protections, and so it's being used quite rampantly. And as you said, if one person falls for it, it can do a lot of damage.
So what's next for you guys at Inky? I mean, are there any other big goals or milestones that you're chasing, or is it all about investment and ensuring that the system actually evolves with the threats? I
mean, it's a lot about that too. I think, for us, we're at the stage where we're shipping the product's for sale, and we have customers, and now it's about that kind of growth phase of trying to get rapid adoption. And of course, one of the hallmarks, they're kind of very broadly two different kinds of software startups. There's the ones that do things for consumers, and then there's the ones that do things for enterprise customers. And with enterprise customers, the sales cycle is obviously a lot longer. You have a IT decision maker who has to agree that something's worth looking into, and then they have to look into it, then they have to contract for it, and then, so usually the cycle's a lot longer. And so we're sort of at the beginning of doing this, and we obviously like to have the majority of the large companies in the world using it. And so that's sort of the next phase for us, is building out a sales force. And, this is exactly what we did in the previous company. We started out with Orbitz as a customer, which I don't know if you remember them, but they were a cross-shopping site in travel. And then over the next 10 years, we kind of added a bunch of the airlines. We added Kayak, a bunch of other travel intermediaries, and just sort of built out a portfolio of business. And that's sort of where we are. We're at the beginning of that process with Inky now. And of course, we're always going to make the software continuously improve because the attackers are continuously improving.
Well, a big thank you for taking the time to come on the show today. But before I let you go, can you just remind listeners of that URL that you set up so listeners can go over and take a look and actually take advantage of that free offer?
Yeah, absolutely. So our domain is inky.com, inky.com. And the landing page for this podcast is inky.com/techblogwriter. And if they go there, they'll see all the details on how to get the free Outlook and Gmail versions. And if they're interested in getting the enterprise one, we also have information on there about that too. But inky.com/techblogwriter.
Excellent. I think it's incredibly scary that the bad guys can now create and add a phishing page on a real company website. So for that fact alone, I think it's worth people signing up, and especially because it's free. I mean, you've got nothing to lose, right?
Absolutely. And, you know, one of the funny things is people say it's kind of cool to, like, see what Inky thinks about their mail. I mean, it's sort of fun. So there's a lot of stuff going on in mail that we're not totally aware of. So Inky may find things that are funny about your mail. It won't say they're malicious, but it might say, you know, for example, I noticed recently I got a message where the URL and the guy's signature had an extra space. It was just a broken link.
Yeah.
He didn't even know that about his own signature in his mail. So, but Inky noticed because Inky doesn't like differences in URLs and where they go. So it's kind of fun to try it too and see what it says about your mail.
Absolutely. Well, again, a big thank you for coming on and sharing your story today.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Neil.
It seems that despite all the technology defence systems or education pieces put into businesses, there will always be one person who will click on that rogue PDF or zip file. But equally, phishing attempts are now becoming much more sophisticated, and the fact that they're monitoring your CFO's social media to use convincing lies to get you to download an attachment or even a rogue page on an authentic website, it's clear that we need a little bit more help. So I'm going to give Inky a try and report back to you, and also let me know what your thoughts on Inky, or indeed any alternatives that you're currently using. Let's keep sharing those stories, insights and expertise.
Do you want to appear on the show, or do you have any questions for Neil? Remember, you can reach him at techblogwriter@outlook.com or visit his website at www.techblogwriter.co.uk.
It's time for me to go now. I will say before I do sign off though that I have a big name guest dropping next week, and I hope you'll join me. But until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thanks for listening to the Tech Blog Writer Podcast. Until next time, remember, technology is best when it brings people together.